I think it's just connecting. I'm not sure what's happening here. We're having a few slight issues. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. But I can't, something is slightly wrong with my screen for some reason. Let me see what's going on here. There. Okay, great. We're ready. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give a lecture to you. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm only the spokesperson for a group of my colleagues here at Ateneo, and this is our collective work. So I'd like to recognize, please, David Lozada, Bianca Claveria, who has now left us and is in Leiden, and Camille Silva, who is with the National University in Lipa. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the work that Bea Goulinao has done, who's joined us middle of last year on the project that we've been working on the historical data papers for the last, nearly a year and a half now. So this work is drawn from the historical data papers, and is a project that's funded by the University Research Council here at Ateneo. And what I want to do is talk about the great and little tradition of disasters in the Philippines, what I call the reciprocity of misfortune. And just as there's a great and little tradition in religion and civilizations, an idea first mooted by the American anthropologist Robert Redford in the 1950s, there's also a great and little tradition in disasters. The universalized collective heritages, ideas like Islam or Christianity or Rome and Confucianism, have their counterparts in disaster risk reduction in the universalized canons, such as the Hyogo Framework for Action, or in 2005, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, and many other similar kinds of frameworks. And just as there's a little tradition in religion and civilization fixed on localized heritage and knowledge, so there is a little tradition in disasters based on community reciprocity and forms of mutual benefit. This separation between the great and the little tradition is, however, more apparent than real. The great is really only ever an upward creation from the little, in a sense, it's universalization, and at the same time, there's always a downward dissemination from the universal to the local, a process that McKim Marriott referred to as parochialization. So the great and the little, in a sense, form two parts of a circular flow in which each repeatedly informs and transforms the other, but the origins of the great are always rooted in the little. And the Philippines is a very good case to look at this kind of framework of the great and the little traditions in disasters. The Philippines is recognized as one of the most hazardous places to live on Earth, and the ceaseless struggle to feed and shelter a family, and at the same time to contend with the repeated natural hazards, in fact, promotes a need for collective action. The need to cooperate is based on self-interest and mutual benefit, a sort of web of dyadic and community relationships that constitutes what we have decided to call a reciprocity of misfortune. It's a reciprocity by which, of course, help offered to a neighbor is expected to be repaid when the need arises at a future time, and was, and largely is, the only form of practical insurance against the frequent hardships and misfortunes of rural life, particularly in rural areas. but as a little tradition, it is not, quote here, so much a product of altruism as one of necessity, close quote. Now, most of the quotes I'm going to be giving in the talk from now on are taken from the historical data papers. I don't, for lack of space, I haven't always identified exactly which historical data paper it comes from, but these are quotes, mainly quotes from the historical data papers themselves. And this little tradition based on the reciprocity of misfortune has long existed in the barrio, and it was manifest in the ways in which people faced daily hardships, disaster, and death, and in the many customs and associations regulating socioeconomic relationships at the community level. Unlike its great counterpart enshrined in national law and implemented by government agencies, the little tradition is much less visible and, of course, consequently, much less well documented. And one of the few windows available to us to glimpse its origins are through the historical data papers. This was a nationwide survey that was instituted by President Carino in 1951. It was conducted really between 1951 and 1953. And it's interesting to actually quote exactly what Carino's mandate said about why the reason it was being collected. And this was each barrio and each municipal, each municipio was required to actually write its own history. And he wrote that this would be an important source for those, quote, wishing to write the history of the community. So that was the main intention of this survey. And its pages record the origins, key events, customs, and traditions, as I said, of just about all the municipalities and barrios in the various provinces. And we've been working our way through these. We've worked our way through 30 of them. They still have 19 more to go. As I said, this survey was done in the 1950s, but access to this source has very long been restricted. And the only copy really that was available was a microfilm version that was in the National Library. You had to go in there, put it on a microfilm reader, and you had to copy everything out by hand. So it was impractical to basically look at the historical data papers in any specific way, any more generalized, universal way. It's only in the last couple of years, since it's been digitalized, that it's now become available for us to actually look and get a real glimpse of how the nation was in the 1950s and what it was, what people were, what history people wrote about and what they wrote about themselves. And we could talk, maybe in the question time, we can talk a little bit more what's actually in the historical data paper. The picture you see here is from one of the local histories, and it just illustrates the fact of the incredible detail that is sometimes is recorded here. Here's a map of a local barrio, and you can see the roads, and you can see some of them are incredibly detailed indeed. And these historical data papers then provide an unparalleled record of the little tradition of the barrio across the archipelago. And by analyzing what are referred to in the historical data papers as folkways, we can examine this reciprocity of misfortune that I'm talking about and the various ways people in the past helped one another. And the picture that is presented to us is one of a resilient and self-reliant peoples not dependent on external sources of support, but relying on each other. Both relying on each other, cooperating to plant their fields, build their homes, repair their buildings, care for their sick, educate their children, deal with disasters, and bury their dead. And this little tradition of the barrio, adopted and adapted at the national level, now, I would argue, provides the conceptual framework upon which the national emergency management policies and practices in the Philippines are currently based. So let's look at the various forms of cooperation and the various ways in which hardship and misfortune were dealt with in rural. As I said, we're looking from the 1950s backwards. It covers a period really from the late 19th century right up until the period that the survey was done in 51 to 53. And first of all, let's look at the little tradition and rural life, rural living, the hardships of rural living. Food and shelter were a concern of Filipinos in rural areas prior to World War II. Of course, they are very much still today, but perhaps even more pressingly then. Land needed to be cleared, and that required labor and labor beyond simply the family. Trees needed to be felled, the stumps needed to be removed, holders or irrigation canals had to be dug. All these things required community labor or labor, extra familiar labor, let's call it that. In more mountainous areas, the land might even require leveling. Cooperation was particularly pronounced in areas of new settlement, such as the central Luzon plain, where, and I said these are quotes from the historical data papers, quote, working cooperatively was their virtue in any undertaking to make the work faster and livelier, end quote. Farmers also required extra familiar labor to plow, plant, and harvest. And people worked expecting that, quote, when his turn for cleaning his fields comes, his neighbor will help him in payment of previous services, end quote. And this kind of reciprocity extended way beyond to other aspects of rural life, such as preparing and distributing food, to livestock that was kept on common land or on agreed upon areas of a municipality after the harvest had been taken in. And often even the raising of animals was shared between owners, and the historical data papers gives very interesting examples of how animals were shared in between owners. Even fishing communities followed similar cooperatives. The Kasama system of practices in which the catch was divided between vessel owners and all the fisher folk that were involved. We can see the little tradition on rural life also in building houses, which was also a collective endeavor. Men went to the forest to cut logs for the posts or to be sawn into boards for walls and floors, and everybody in the neighborhood offered to help. Quote, it is the custom of the people that when a certain family plans to build a house, they but only pass a word to their neighbors that on a certain day they will start building, and everybody comes. Houses were erected, quote, without employing hired lay carpenters or laborers, end quote. Naturally, of course, there was an obligation to reciprocate if called upon to do so. Cooperation was deemed essential to the survival of the barrio as it fostered, open quote, closer ties, unity, and understanding in the community, end quote. This cooperation extended to the construction of the principal buildings in any barrio. First, the church, and more latterly, the schoolhouse. And what we see, of course, was the rise in population over this period from about a little over 6 million people in the at the turn of the 20th century to around over 20.5 million people by 1953. There was a whole lot of new settlement, and therefore there was a whole lot of new building that had to be done. More chapels, more churches, more schools. The churches needed and the chapels needed, quote, to encourage and to rehabilitate the moral and spiritual lives of the inhabitants. And what we see, interestingly enough, is the way in which these structures were built. these churches or chapels were built, land was donated by prominent local families, or if there wasn't a prominent local family, it was purchased with funds that were raised by voluntary contributions by the entire community. Barrio folk then provided money to buy the materials. They volunteered their labor to build the structures, and they even supplied the furniture. So even the pitchers, the benches, the candles, all these things were provided by the local community. Once we get into the 20th century, and the first or from about the second decade of the 20th century, the community becomes galvanized by the construction of the schoolhouse. It becomes the other really important building in the barrio. Again, the material needed for the school, as in the case of Barrio Agdancao in Abra, were donated by its residents. And it's interesting here because you can see the way in which contributions were calibrated. So in this particular barrio, each family head had to provide 1 cubic meter of stone. That was the way it was. Sometimes it was money, sometimes it was labor, sometimes it was materials. And many schoolhouses were in fact built by the parents of prospective pupils. You wanted your pupil to go to school, your child to go to school, you helped build the schoolhouse to do so. And if external help was needed, if carpenters were needed from outside the community, then their labor was paid for by local contributions. So, for instance, the residents of Barrio Cozili in Abra held a contest or put on a contest to crown a barrio queen, and in the process were able to raise 200 pesos towards hiring the neighbor that they needed. If we move away from just the everyday hardships of rural living and focus on misfortune in a more general or more specific sense, I should say, and we can see here that even as people faced hardships through reciprocity and cooperation, so they confronted life's misfortunes in a similar manner as a community. The American anthropologist Mary Hornsteiner in the 1960s notes that reciprocity was, quote, was designed to achieve security through interdependence, end quote. And of course, misfortune took many forms, but the principal danger was from hazards, particularly typhoons and floods, or even the absence of typhoons had posed its own peril in the form of drought that led to crop failure and famine. And the buildings that acted as the community hub, the church, and later the schoolhouse, were constantly damaged and constantly requiring repair and maintenance from the depredations of both physical and human nature. And people's cooperation was regarded by the community as, quote, unquestionable, end quote, repeatedly rebuilding the school, even though many times destroyed by the typhoon. You get this coming through from the historical data papers. They've just finished the school, there's a typhoon, it gets completely destroyed. They're right back there the next year, rebuilding the schoolhouse and such like. World War II, of course, left a terrible toll on countless communities around the Philippines. Resistance to the Japanese between 1944 and 1945 devastated many barrios, especially on Luzon. And what really comes very apparent and very clear through the historical data papers is the devastation caused by the United States Air Force in the I don't know whether liberation of the Philippines is the most appropriate word, but certainly in the attempt to drive the Japanese out of the Philippines in 1944 and 1945. As an example, though this is in rural areas, Paco Church was reduced to, quote, a roofless, pockmarked enclosure, end quote, by Japanese Marines in 1945. But what did the parishioners do? They raised the incredible sum of 120,000 pesos towards its rehabilitation. In rural areas, schools were commandeered by the Japanese army and damaged in the subsequent fighting. and Japanese troops often pulled down schoolhouses, like in Barrio Sawatan in Abra, because it was seen as, quote, a good hiding place for guerrillas. But perhaps the little tradition is most apparent when we start talking about death in the Philippines. As the anthropologist Saban Yu says, quote, death in the Philippines is primarily a matter of community. Death creates community. And death was very much a communal affair. In the words of one historical data paper, quote, the sorrows or misfortunes suffered by one person or family become the concern of the whole neighborhood, end quote. People not only offered their condolences and sat there during the night, off keeping watch over the body to prevent the aswang from stealing the corpse, but they stayed often for the 9 days of the novena, the rituals, death rituals. They brought gifts, both in kind and money, everything, food, but also candles, flowers, all the things that were required in honoring the dead. And or they volunteered to help in preparing the body for burial, or in feeding all the guests, which was a mammoth task, because they had to have the end of the 9 days, there was a big festival, a big meal, which had to be catered for. But also in the myriad duties, volunteering the myriad duties about the house and preparing the body for burial, but in feeding and serving, but also in arranging the funeral rituals. And also just in carrying on the daily tasks, because you weren't allowed, the family of the bereaved didn't work at all during the period of mourning, but of course the farm had to be kept going and things. So people would come and volunteered and did all that kind of labor. It was left to the men, especially the carpenters, to make the coffin for the deceased. And what really comes through from the historical data papers is the really important role and status of carpenters in the community. They were really, they were exempt from any other contribution. And they obviously had a very important place in the local community. Once we get to the island of Bohol, we see an entirely different, or we see the death rituals elevated to an entirely different level of cooperation and association. This seems to be almost entirely unique to Bohol, though there are sort of semblances of it in other places. On Bohol, the practices surrounding death and burial coalesced into associations that rendered assistance to bereaved families. Membership in the community was in one or even more mutual benefit association. This ensured that a family had help in making the burial arrangements and in defraying the costs that were involved. In some communities, you even had 4 or 5 of these associations, and everybody was enlisted into one of these. Types of associations varied between those that only provided financial aid and those that arranged the funeral, arranged for the digging of the grave, carrying of the coffin, the conveying of the priest. Often the priest was conveyed in the sedan chair to the actual burial site, and in administering the last rites to the dying. Services were available only to members who paid their dues. And there were very strict kind of tribunals for those who failed to actually honor their contribution or failed to pay their dues. And clearly, these associations were very much part of the social fabric of communities on Bohol, even in the 1950s. This is clearly not something that they're just talking about the past, they're talking about the present as well. They were known about the island by different names, but most frequently referred to as Dayon, or some sort of variation on that. And these institutionalized forms of reciprocity that are apparent on Bohol become more pronounced during American rule, especially as regards education. And the Parent Teachers Association, the PTA, became the most dynamic organization in the barrios after their creation in 1926. But they're not dedicated simply to education. They cover a much wider range of activities in the community. And I think this is often something that gets overlooked. People just think they're an educational institution. And together with the later public school-sponsored Purok system, these two types of barrio organizations exemplified a community's more concerted program of self-improvement and economic development. The PTAs played a crucial role in the building of the school. They decided, first of all, that a community needed one. They then raised the funds. They arranged the labor, and they liaised with government agencies and organizations. The land, like as in the church, formerly in the church, the land and the material were often also donated by the PTA, and the community worked tirelessly to improve a structure once it had been erected. They raised money to buy the desk, to install glass windows, to purchase equipment, most particularly something like a sewing machine for the community. The PTAs were also primarily responsible for repairing the schools damaged first by typhoons and very particularly, of course, during World War II. And the American sociologists Romani and Thomas estimated that between 50 and 60% of the schools they visited in the 1950s had actually been constructed not by the government, but by the PTAs. Not only did the PTAs actually build the structures, they often paid the teachers' salaries as well, especially at the beginning. The community would build a school, they would hire a teacher, and at that point, then the government would match it by sending the second year would send another teacher. So it was a sort of a close kind of relationship. Or alternatively, if the salary was too low for the teacher, then the PTA would supplement inadequate ones, as it was recognized that the government, quote, was not as yet in a financial position to provide all the necessities, the necessary expenses. As an example, in the barrio of Asisis in Batangas, the parents contributed 50 cents a month for each child they sent to the school to supplement the teacher's salary. The PTA was also an important agent of rural development, dedicated to bettering the quality of life of both individuals and the community. And we see them setting up social reading centers in the school buildings, stocked with newspapers, weekly magazines, books, radio sets, hosting karaoke evenings, dramatic evenings, such like, hosting too community programs and services, such as the drives to improve local sanitation, public cleanliness, and in some cases, even establishing clinics, all associated with the school, all associated and run by the Parent Teachers Association. Interestingly, even more, PTAs were often involved in the construction and maintenance of roads. I can only surmise I can find no reason why they were, but we can surmise perhaps that this was to facilitate children's access to the school, especially sometimes two different barrios would combine together to build one schoolhouse, and therefore, of course, people had to be able to reach the school, and perhaps that's the reason. But it was also obviously evidently seen as a way of improving the local economy too, facilitating trade, commerce, farming, and such like. And we can clearly see from the sort of 1920s and 1930s on that the school is eclipsing the church as the nexus of local development, and especially with the community schools program instituted by the Bureau of Public Schools in 1950. Of course, this is almost at the period when the survey is done, so we don't really have too much of a vision of how successful the community school program was. However, having said that, the barrio schools were regarded as, quote, the only agency or institution which can be depended upon for the leadership in cooperative social actions for the improvement of the culture and economic life of the people, end quote. Subsequently, too, we get the division of barrios into pueblos. Now, this is instituted from the 1950s, part of the community school program. A purok is the lowest unit of a recognized unit of local government. It's under 100 people. They do have their own offices. It's basically a series of households clustered in a neighborhood. And this is what constitutes support. They were envisaged, however, to implement the community school program and charged with a whole range of activities, organizing adult education classes to eradicate illiteracy, running the reading centers, promoting good citizenship and civic cooperation, improving health conditions in the locality, and organizing proper waste disposal and drainage. So really fundamental kind of services to the community. Members, as in the PTAs, members of the puroks volunteered their time and labor for the community and, quote, in its barely 1 year of existence, has wrought incalculable progress in the rural areas. That's from a historical data paper in APLA. And the reciprocity of misfortune and the little tradition of cooperation developed these more institutionalized forms like the parent-teacher associations and the puroks by the early 1950s. What's important to remember there, and it was even recognized at the time, that what they were doing was not novel. It wasn't seen as being novel, but based on long-held community traditions. As one school teacher observed, quote, the purok system now being initiated by the school authorities has long been practiced by them, end quote. So what I'm talking about here then is a very vibrant tradition of cooperation in the face of all forms of hardships. And I think we can look at what I regard as a very important book on Southeast Asian societies, which was James C. Scott's The Moral Economy. And Scott identifies what he called a, quote, subsistence ethic and a, quote, moral economy in Southeast Asian societies. What he referred to as a safety-first principle, as peasants were much more likely to prioritize a minimum level of security over maximizing profits that might involve greater risk. It was a moral economy in that the web of social arrangements ensured that risks were shared within a community. The result is a society characterized not by equality, but by equity, and village norms and customs that were adapted to accommodate frequent threats and misfortunes that threatened their peasants' livelihood. And this vibrant little tradition of cooperation still clearly existed in rural areas in the 1950s, or the early 1950s, based on forms of reciprocity that improved people's chances of facing and overcoming the everyday hazards of barrio life. McKim Marriott depicts a cyclical process when we return to the idea of the great and the little tradition, whereby a little tradition is absorbed into a universal great tradition that is thereby changed by that absorption and then disseminated downward again back to the local. And this same process of universalization and parochialization, I think, is evident between the reciprocity of misfortune at the local level and the promotion nowadays of community-based disaster risk management at the national and international level in the Philippines. CBDRM aims to reduce people's vulnerabilities by capitalizing on local level resources and capacities. It's an alternative to the top-down disaster management policies that were instituted by President Marcos Sr., Ferdinand Marcos, in 1978, PD 1566, and gained official recognition as state policy with RA 10121 in 2010, where basically community-based disaster risk management is recognized as the official policy of government agencies. I would argue, of course, that that is simply adopting the little tradition of reciprocity and cooperation in the barrio and absorbing it into the great tradition of national government emergency management. CBDRM emphasizes local participation and acknowledges people's capacities, echoing the barrio's, quote, spirit of neighborliness and cooperation, end quote. In CBDRM, village people always, open quote, treat each other as relatives, end quote, and is now advocated, or the main guidelines advocated by non-government organizations and government officials alike as their policy aims. PURPs were officially hailed as a strikingly efficient system of disaster risk reduction and even recognized by the UN as a model to be emulated globally. They were seen as representing, quote, a traditional method of self-organization that disseminates information and assesses risk in communities with limited access to internet, mobile phones, and radios. And importantly, I think I'll talk about this perhaps in the questions, with the ability to raise funds by voluntary contributions to help themselves. It's like echoing their neoliberal ideas, but anyhow. This local spirit of cooperation is also expressed in state ideology, and we would argue that this is really what is behind the concepts of Bayanihan. It's widely evoked in public now in government circles. Bayanihan has a universal meaning, coming to stand for all those selfless values said to be characteristic of all Filipinos. In debates over Filipino identity, Bayanihan is seen as emblematic of a resurgent national spirit and was pushed by President Ferdinand Marcos as part of his corporatist visions of a new society. During the COVID pandemic, Bayanihan was evoked by President Duterte to promote volunteerism by state-controlled information outlets and agencies. Even the Asian Development Bank called its rapid emergency supply project for vulnerable households Bayanihan, quoting from them, quote, based on the traditional Filipino Bayanihan principle of community spirit, end quote. So in conclusion then, when we're looking at the little and the great tradition in the Philippines, I think we can see that a way has developed in the Philippines to face the dangers of hardship and misfortune that's based on reciprocity, cooperation in the community. This reciprocity of misfortune forms the little tradition in the barrio. It predates the colonial period. It evolved through Spanish domination and found expression in more institutionalized forms, as we've indicated, between 1900 and 1950. And this little tradition was gradually absorbed into a great tradition of community-based disaster risk management after 1978, especially after 2010, and in a repackaged form is currently implemented as state emergency management policy. The historical data papers offer us, and the material in it offers us a unique panorama of these changes, how people found ways to deal with hardship and disasters and to face death by working together. This was a cooperation born out of necessity, a reciprocity of misfortune that now enjoys international recognition and near universal advocacy as community-based disaster risk management. And that's my talk. You there? Are you there, Mark?
Very much.
Finished.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Greg. And it was a very comprehensive discussion of disasters and how using informal community-based strategies, people all over the Philippines were able to survive the aftermath of disasters. And so we already have quite a number of questions here using our chat box as well as our Q&A box in Zoom. In our chat box, we have Beatriz Clemente asking, what are your thoughts about the Philippines from the 1950s and its present to the present time? But maybe Beatriz, can you please be more specific? What about the Philippines from the 1950s to the present? Specific, can you please identify a specific aspect of the history of disasters during that period that you want to ask Professor Bancroft? So while waiting for Beatrice to be more specific about her question, let me just point to two questions here in our Q&A box, and I want to relay this to Professor Bancroft. This one coming from Professor Mary Racelis. The undermining of death traditions relying on community reciprocity were severely affected in urban settings with the movement restrictions during the pandemic, as well as the Duterte administration's EJKs, generating many deaths and a climate of fear. Traditional mutual help during funerals, fallback actions done through online contacts and rituals, illustrating your point of the significance of mutual help in small disasters. So Professor Mary Racelis is asking for your comments on mutual help, reciprocity during the pandemic and during the Duterte administration's handling of these EJK cases.
Well, I mean, I think that's very interesting. I mean, of course, the big question is that with the historical data papers, we're looking backwards. So we have, we're looking back from 51, 53. So, how much has this reciprocity of misfortune continued and into today? And I think there's various indications that it has, though I think it's also changed quite dramatically. I mean, we've had huge population movement, especially towards rural, from rural to urban areas. So communities are not as homogeneous as they were before, which might suggest, of course, that these forms of cooperation therefore aren't carried forward. I've done some work in this, and what always surprised me is that how a new tradition of cooperation can grow up actually relatively quickly, even with different ethnic groups or people from different areas, forming not the same long tradition, but in some ways a similar tradition, perhaps not as pronounced. And I think during the COVID pandemic, you saw all sorts of ways in which the community, the classic one would be the community kitchens as a form of this kind of cooperation. But I think there were many others too, in which that this was apparent. So I guess that my answer would be that I don't think it's gone, but it may have changed and morphed in many ways. What is interesting, however, is that it's still enshrined. I mean, that's the argument we're putting forward in this paper, that it's still actually enshrined now in community-based disaster risk management. It's enshrined in the 2010 Act, basically. That this spirit of cooperation, what we're talking about, the little tradition, has become the great tradition. And then the question rises, how much does the great tradition then influence back the local tradition? And I think that would be another interesting paper. It would look at the way in which NGOs try to carry out what the community-based disaster risk management in the communities that they serve, because that would be an example of the great tradition being disseminated back to the local.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Banca, for addressing Professor Mary Racelis' comment. Next, we have Ruchi Pototano. There are scholars who consider the historical data papers, HDP, as an unreliable source because they were written by people who are not trained in history. What are your thoughts on this revival of appreciation for the HDP, and should it be considered as the resurgence of community-based history writing?
Oh my goodness. How much I disagree with that point of view. Okay, it's what do we regard as history? I mean, history is always how you interpret the sources anyhow, not the sources themselves. What you get with the historical data papers is, of course, a huge variety of responses. In most cases, it's clearly the local mayor mandated the local school teacher and said, "You do it." And that's what they had to do. So it really depended on the skills, the insights of the school teacher. But occasionally, we actually get some information on how the data was gathered, which is really interesting. So you'll get, I mean, as I said, it's usually the local school, not all the time, but mainly the local school teacher who is tasked with this charge. He or she will call together all the old people in the community and get them together. It's a focus group discussion, if we're going to call it in sociological terms. They get all the old people together and they talk about all these things and they flesh it out. There were 7 questions basically that were asked of all the communities. One of them was basically on the name of your origin and your origins. There were 3 historical ones, and then there were 3 what were classified as folkways, which we would see as customs and traditions. And there are 9 of information. I mean, some of them, I mean, I love a lot of answers. I mean, so you get one of the historical questions is, what is the major event that happened during the Spanish occupation of the Philippines? 333 years, right? And you get one word, nothing, and that's it. That's the entire historical content. So obviously that doesn't, well, I mean, it tells you something, I guess, but doesn't tell you an awful lot. But on the other hand, you can get pages and pages of material out there. So it's very, very varied. As a historical source, as a source of perceptions, as a source of all sorts of material that don't get into historical documents, like the PTAs, like the death association. I couldn't find, the only thing I could find on death associations in the Philippines was about 3 lines in one paper on Visayan traditions. So they open a window to us of, and they're not just of interest to historians. I mean, I think anthropologists would go berserk with looking at the information that's in there, especially on talking about marriage rights, or sociologists too, marriage rights, burial customs, all sorts of information that are in there. The folk. I'll give you another example. We have the group that's working on these. We have another project because we found all these musical scores suddenly appearing in the historical data papers. I mean, not just lyrics, but musical scores. We have about 1,800 lyrics and about 180 complete musical scores, which we're now working with UP College of Music and ethnomusicology to analyze. Because, I mean, again, if the school teacher had interest in music and was able to write it, they wrote it down. So here we have another incredible source of information about local culture. So I hope I'm making my point clear that I think it's a really important historical source. I'm sorry to disagree with the question, but that's how I feel about it.
Yes, okay. No problem. And I think Ruchi is making the thumbs up signal. Thank you, Ruchi, for the question. And then before I proceed to the next question, let me just read this comment coming from Professor Mary Racelis. Just for information, I appreciate Dr. Bancroft quoting me as American Mary Holsteiner, but he should know I'm actually the Filipina Mary Racelis here online. So just a point of clarification from Professor Mary Racelis. Okay, so moving on to the next question, this one from Carl Patrick de Lima. If this tradition of reciprocity is community initiated, how suspicious should we be to corporate entities using bayanihan as an advertising campaign when these entities are neither public nor communal?
Well, that's a very political question to answer, isn't it? I mean, that's a one.
Yes.
I think you should be highly suspicious of it. I mean, but of course, this is something that happens all the time. I mean, ideas get suborned for all sorts of purposes. And I think, even going back to the 1950s and the community school program, the modern recognition of the Puruks as models, UN models, which might seem to be an accolade of this little tradition in the Philippines, and I think it partly is, but also it's interesting that they emphasize the ability of communities to raise funds by themselves, which has a large flavor, I might say, odor of neoliberalism. However, I mean, having said that, I think the ideas and values that we're talking about here are extremely important and valuable. So it's a mixture. Yes, it will be subordinate. Yes, it will be used for other purposes as it was in the previous administration. But at the same time, of course, there's that doesn't undervalue or undermine the traditions and values that it actually encompasses, and we should focus on those. I'm a great supporter of community-based disaster risk management. I think it's the way to go.
Okay, thank you. And now that we are on the subject of neoliberalism, here's another question that was initially sent to me directly. I posted here on the chat box for everyone to read. Question for Professor Bancroft: any limitation on the CBDRRM, community-based disaster risk reduction management, on perhaps romanticizing resiliency of communities, thereby lessening states to proactively create better policies for preparedness in disasters?
No, I quite agree. I mean, and I think that is one of the pitfalls. And that's, as I said, really everything is a balance between its advantages and disadvantages. And community-based disaster risk management can be used, of course, to how should I put, to put the responsibility of dealing with hazards and the vulnerability of communities back on the community. It's a way of decentralizing services, so that which also involves, of course, definancing services, because advocating community-based disaster risk management, empowering local communities also usually means that they have to pay for it themselves, rather than. So, it is a mixture. It's always a mixture between the two. And again, it depends for which purposes it's being implemented. So, you can have NGOs implementing community-based disaster risk management with all the best aims in mind, and you can have governments instituting it with much more mixed aims and objectives. So yes, I mean, it can be, but I think, again, I would stress the importance of the principles behind community-based disaster risk management and the communities behind what is not uniquely by any means, but a profoundly local and important cultural tradition within the Philippines. The Philippines is one of the leaders in community-based disaster risk management. And I guess is what my colleagues and I are saying in this paper, this is the reason why. There's a very long tradition of this that is deeply rooted in the communities that it has evolved.
Yeah. So I guess, community-based disaster management has its advantages as well as its disadvantages.
Yeah.
So another question from Jamil Liza. Moving forward, do you see the reciprocity of misfortune regarding disaster management? How does this relate to the glorification of the Filipinos' resilience during disasters and undermining disaster risks. The tendency to glorify resiliency among Filipinos.
Yes, I mean, that's quite similar to the previous question in many ways. So that in a sense, of course, it does glorify. I think, I guess it goes back to what people mean by Bayanihan, and I think Bayanihan now has become so universalized. It's a sort of, it is almost a characteristic trait. What the historical data papers clearly show, however, and what we were arguing very much, that in the past, yes, of course it was that, but it was also a dyadic relationship. It was a deal. It was a contract. You help me, I'll help you. If you don't help me, you put yourself and your family at risk. Now, and it was, there were a whole lot of community values, community traditions that, in a sense, helped fortify that you complied to this kind of tradition. So that it was actually very difficult not to comply, not to be part of it, whether you wanted to or not. And it's interesting that, for instance, as I said, with the deaths, the Dayongs in Bohol, there were really strict kind of tribunals for people who defaulted, who basically tried to get out of it, or didn't fulfill what the community thought was the appropriate obligation that they had incurred. And these people would be ostracized. They were, yes, it's romanticized to a certain extent, but actually it was a dyadic relationship. It was a contract. Now, we lost that with Bayanihan as it is understood today. I don't think that contractual reciprocity is quite as is understood. I don't think actually really, it would be interesting to do a survey and actually see what people understood by Bayanihan. But I think it's come this more universalized form of custom and value rather than a specific relationship that you will help your neighbor when he helps you.
Okay, and Professor Mary Gacelis posts a comment here in our Q&A box. While the CBDRM does highlight community strengths, actual implementation tends to be local or international authorities deciding for them what the people need to do. Genuine community efforts are insufficiently recognized and tend to force people into dependency welfare roles rather than as initiating forces. Where groups have organized to contest humanitarian response trends that appear to verge on corruption and local favoritism, they are all too often regarded as quote-unquote discontents or troublemakers by local officials. The ideal situation you describe is still far from the truth in implementation.
No,
so that's Professor Gacelis' comment.
Mike, I wouldn't disagree with that. And that goes back to the very first question you asked me was, what are the differences between the period we're talking about and the period now? And to what extent is community the same as it was in the past? How strong are they? How different are the hardships and misfortunes that now face communities? Climate change, population pressure, environmental degradation. All these things were not so apparent in the past. So we probably have a different set of circumstances. And I still, okay, so when it's CBDR and when it's tried to be implemented, I know exactly where the speaker is coming from in this sense. And there are all sorts of problems with it. But I would still argue that the principles behind it are important, regardless of the way it's implemented. And of course, in the Philippines, that's always the big question. Wonderful laws, but how are they implemented? It's always about implementation, law and implementation, or policy and law and policy, aims, principles, and the way in which they're put into practice. as I said, I don't disagree with the speaker at all.
Thank you, Professor Bancroft. And then another question from Kamarudin bin Alawi Mohammed. What is your take on studying disasters through the lens of indigenous perspective? For instance, a kind of ethnoseismology, perhaps, and the like?
Yeah, now, okay, so what do you, I'd like to ask the speaker what they define as indigenous then. Are we talking about a sort of, you know, an equivalent of psicologia Filipina kind of in disasters, or are we talking about, you know, indigenous peoples in the Cordilleras, or I'm not quite sure what's being asked here. You know,
I think most probably it's the latter.
The latter, okay. Yeah. You know, I guess I don't really, and I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't see an enormous distinction between culture, because it's classified as indigenous, or culture because it's highland, and culture and it's lowland. To me, and I guess this is more coming from a sort of geographical perspective, that that both are equally valid, and I mean I wouldn't particularly see any form of indigenous form of cooperation in any way different from, or to be judged or assessed in any way different from lowland communities and what they did. And in fact, I mean, it's interesting because looking, as I said, the historical data papers, just to take one example, are really very, very rich in terms of the rituals surrounding death. I think that probably came clear in our presentation, but I mean, it's the small fraction of what, you know, the death rituals in the Cordillera were not that dramatically different to the death rituals that I'm talking about, we've talked about in lowland communities. I mean, one of the big differences was that the corpse was actually, the body was actually sat in a chair in the middle of a room, and people sat and feasted around it. But again, you know, the way in which the customs were pretty similar. I mean, you know, I would have to go back to making an argument that actually, why do we have such a definitive division between highland and lowland, between indigenous cultures and lowland cultures? As I said, I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm sure I'll be shot down for saying such things, but I just don't see it. To me, and from my perspective, what I'm talking about, I don't think it's really a particularly salient issue.
Okay. And then earlier, Beatriz Clemente posted a question on Philippine history from the 1950s to the present. And to further clarify, I think she's asking you about close camaraderie between Filipinos being tested through disasters, invasions, concept of bayanihan. So more or less, you've already discussed this in your talk, but maybe you can you elaborate on the difference between what was happening in the 1950s and the present in terms of bayanihan? Is there a discernible difference between the early post-war period and the present time?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we haven't talked about, of course, in this discussion at all, it's not really relevant in my paper, is media. I mean, you know, and I think it's the role of the media in creating fictive notions of bayanihan, and that is so much more apparent. I mean, and of course, the media is, if we're looking at one of the big differences between the pre-1950 period and now, would be the role of the media in this, and how it disseminates. I mean, It's a good question of whether it brings people closer together or whether it isolates people further apart. I'm not sure, but it certainly it helps to promote generalized notions of collective values and norms. And Bayanihan is well. I mean, it's interesting that under Duterte it was the Philippine Information Agency and things like that that were pumping out this. In other words, it was being the media was being specifically used to promulgate and promote these ideas. So I think that's where I would focus on is the really big difference.
Thank you. And I guess this is gonna be the last question, although this is not exactly a question, but more of a comment coming from Kent de Lima. Paz Verdedade Santos mentions pagbagunas. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Mentions pagbagunas or deep cleansing and paglaom, hopefulness, as pervasive motifs of Bicol poetry responding to natural disasters such as typhoons, especially given that Bicol is a typhoon magnet. So I'd love to see more localized sensibilities of this tradition in your future studies. So any comments on those notions of pagbagunas, deep cleansing, and paglaom, hopefulness in Bicol poetry?
So I'm not familiar with those. So thank you very much. And if you would be so kind as to email me, I will certainly look into those. I'm not familiar with either of this tradition, this tradition at all in Bicol poetry. So thank you very much for making me aware of that. And please do email me. I have an Ateneo email. It's quite easy to find. I'm allowed to, I don't suppose I'm allowed to say, just gbankof@ateneo.edu. So please contact me. I'd love to hear more about it. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Kent de Lima, for sharing those insights. Yes, he'll send it through the co-host. You can send it to me, or you can send it directly to Professor Bankoff via his Ateneo email. Okay, I guess that more or less concludes this afternoon's webinar. On behalf of the Department of History, I would like to thank you, Professor Bankoff, for sharing with us your thoughts and the results gathered by the team in uncovering many of these lesser known instances of community building, disaster risk management at the grassroots level via the historical data papers. On behalf of the History Department, also, I would like to thank our participants in this afternoon's webinar, our audience, the people who posted their questions, their comments. Thank you very much. So
thank you.
That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much for hosting it, and thank you very much to the audience for some wonderful questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff, for answering those questions as well. And so, on behalf of the Department of History, once again, I'm your moderator, Mike Pante, and thank you very much, and may you have a nice day. Thank you.